Good morning and welcome to another book-based interview where today we're interviewing fantasy author Gabriel Garcia. Gabriel has always loved history and storytelling, leading to the release of his first novel, The Gathering. Years later, Gabe has released three more novels as well as hosted a podcast called Tales from the Wandering Scribe. If you are interested in following Gabriel on his journey, please check out his website, wanderingscribe.com, to get updates on everything he's worked on thus far, as well as his Instagram at Arbiter283 and YouTube channel at Tales from the Wandering Scribe. Gabriel, thank you so much for being here.
Nathan, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm so excited to be on your guys' show.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. The first question I love asking authors is when did you decide you wanted to become an author and what was that journey like?
Absolutely. So, I actually began my journey. Well, it was actually a series of moments, to say the least. So, I've always loved writing. Shout out to my third grade teacher, Mrs. Trost, who instilled that creative spark in me at a very young age. And then, of course, with the lockdown back in the early 2020s, that's what really pushed me to become a full time author or on the journey to become a full time author because, we were all in lockdown. We couldn't go out, we couldn't meet our friends. So a lot of us had to do something. And for me, that was writing. And because of that, I was able to write all of my books, which, little fun fact, all of the books that I have currently published on Barnes& and Noble and Amazon were written within 2 years on a platform called Inkit. So all of these books are what I like to call my COVID books because they were all written during the first few years of COVID. So these books are very, very special to me in that regard.
Wow, that is awesome. I mean, of course, like the pandemic, like everybody was going crazy around that time. Like I think you found an extremely healthy outlet to just start writing your stories and stuff. What was it like writing your first novel, The Gathering? Like, did you already have the story preconceived earlier in your life, where you're like, oh, this would be a great idea, or was this something where you were just sitting down, you're like, I want to get into writing. Oh, okay, I'll just start writing about this.
That's a very good question, Nathan. So, initially, I conceived this idea of like a company of heroes from different battles in history back in 2018 when I was pursuing my undergraduate. And I want to say, 80% done. But I took a step back, I didn't pick it up. And then 2 years later, with the lockdown, I realized I need something to do. So I went back to the gathering. I revamped the outline, and from there, I was able to finish the completed draft. And I absolutely loved the whole process. It was truly, truly an amazing experience. And from there, it's just been a nonstop journey of new books, new series, going back to familiar characters. And in fact, a lot of people who have read The Gathering have messaged me privately on my socials saying, when's the next book coming out for The Gathering? When are the other characters getting their spin offs? And I have to tell them, they're going to be coming soon. It just takes a long, long time just to get everything ready.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's cool that, you're able to just, again, just flesh out a gigantic, epic story like this using characters that, are from battles and like characters you're familiar with. And, I think it's cool that now that you've been able to release these novels, people are actually responding and telling you like, hey, like keep it going, like this is awesome. I think that type of
Mm-hmm.
motivation is extremely important because I think that's what I guess like at some moments, like for example with the pandemic, like yeah, you're writing, but you don't know where this is gonna go. You don't know what the reception's gonna be like, and then you come out of the pandemic with these novels, and then you start releasing them one by one, and people just keep on telling you like, hey, this is great, keep on going, and it's cool to see that your journey as an author was you taking advantage of like what a lot of people would consider to be a dark time, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that itself is a motivational thing where in a moment where people were just really confused and they were trying to find another sense of purpose for those years of just like being isolated. You kind of created your own, and now you're kind of seeing the benefits of your hard work, so congratulations, like that's awesome.
Thank you, Nathan. I really appreciate those kind words.
Yeah, of course. I went on your website and I was able to read about your books, and I was also able to read about you. And I love the fact that you're a real avid fan of history and multiple types of mythologies. And I kind of want to ask, like, how has your passions for history and mythologies allowed you to create a story that told a grander tale?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it all stems from the books I've read as I entered into high school and from then on. So a lot of my favorite authors have been figures like Bernard Cornwell, Conn Iggulden, Stephen Pressfield, Jack White, Alan Smale, Vallejo Manfredi, and of course, on the more fantasy side, which for anyone who remembers his author, the late Brian Jacques of the Redwall series, I absolutely loved reading those stories. And when combining history and mythology, as I've gotten older and started branching out of my comfort zones, I wanted to really write something that was familiar, but also unique to my voice. And a very good example of that is Michael, Last Angel of Earth. Now, while Michael is more purely a epic fantasy, it's not a fantasy that you typically see. It's what I like to call angelic fantasy, dealing with angels and demons. You rarely ever see that in other works. And since I love history and mythology, I wanted to do something very, very unique. And that is, of course, what happens when an angel meets a Roman demigod or a Greek deity. What's the relation going to be like? How are they going to interact? If they fought, who would actually win? And that was really fun to play with and experiment with. Now, kind of more on the history side, when we look at Son of Persia and more recently The Wolf of Rome, yes, those are more specifically history based, alt history, but there is some fantasy sprinkled throughout. It's not like very over the top fantasy, it's more like elemental or natural fantasy, like a magic sword that's locked in a tomb, or meeting an animal guardian who's protecting a tomb that belongs to an ancient warrior. So I love blending the two because that's kind of almost like a heroic myth that we have in our own history. And I wanted to blend my two passions of history and mythology and create something that was entirely new and yet familiar.
No, I totally think that's a great way of being able to blend fantasy and history. And I think it's honestly a refreshing take on how people look at history. I feel like growing up, you would always hear people say history, like, why would you want to study something like that? Like, it's all about the past. But to be able to use something of the past, such as like lore and mythology and, just the way that the world operated back then, and be able to combine that with refreshing elements of fantasy and the way that you're doing with natural fantasies such as like swords or just like the creatures that you encounter. I feel like it kind of adds like a fun spin to history, kind of adds like
Right.
something special to it. And I think it's such a great way for people to kind of dip their toes into the world of history and kind of
Mm,
understanding that, hey, like we can benefit from the stuff that humanity has encountered in the past besides just what our textbooks tell us. Like it kind of inspires a new sense of inspiration, a new sense of like adventure and fantasy even. Like we look at things such as how Tolkien was able to create the Lord of the Rings series,
mm-hmm.
and you read that, and then that is also considered history because it's no longer modern day, but you see the modern implementations of what authors in the past have started and the trends that they created, and we're able to push that envelope. I think that's a great way to like look at like just how you've created your stories and what you've been telling me. And I also wanted to ask, like, in your opinion, what do you think is the importance of studying history and understanding the past? Because I feel like that kind of creates like a really interesting, question when it comes to you as a person, but also you as an author and how you write your novels.
Absolutely very true. And for viewers and listeners, another aspect about me beyond being an author is being an historian. I actually have my BA in Asian history and my MA in classical history. And for a long time before I went to college, I wasn't as interested in history as I am now. It was a series of great teachers and figuring out the kind of history that I wanted to study and learn and share. And by the time I got into my master's program, I was so amazed by the different stories of history that I realized, okay, there are so many things that we are not talking about that needs to be shared. And probably one of the most challenging things as an historian is kind of breaking the mold in the sense that not all of us want to be teachers. Not everyone wants to work for, museums or stuff like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I highly encourage that because we need those more than ever. But generally speaking, not everyone may want to go down that path. But when I was finishing up my master's program, I had the opportunity to meet another historian in a workshop who was a well respected author. And he kind of gave me the confidence of taking my passions of being an author and my love for history and writing about history. And besides writing historical fiction and fantasy books, I also write several historical magazine pieces in small publications like in Command and Hellfighter and the Historians magazine, which is based in the UK, to more recently, I have several articles in Strategy and Tactics, which is the largest and longest running military history publication here in the United States. And it's from these articles that I do write, which are on military history, that I realize that these stories that I'm writing and the stories written by others need to be told. Even if we already know the grand scheme of history and like the major events, there are those smaller personal stories that need to be told because they are important to somebody.
No, I think that's such a great answer. I think if we were students together in school, I would have loved hanging out with you because I'm a huge history fan myself, and growing up, I think my first introduction to like a quote unquote fun version of history, not like I didn't enjoy reading the books, but I remember the Disney movies, National Treasure with Nicolas Cage,
Oh, yes.
and just such a it was my first time seeing such a fun take on something that is like already like I think automatically one of the coolest concepts for children, which is
Mm-hmm.
treasure hunting and trying to find like treasure like that is in like that is right in front of us but is somewhere hidden. And the whole idea of seeing the Declaration of Independence to like learning about our founding fathers and being able to like kind of work with Benjamin Franklin's notes to getting to where he did with his treasure and stuff, like that was one of the coolest things ever. And I remember the second thing that got me was the Uncharted series on the PlayStation for video
Oh,
game
yes.
fans. Yeah, like just taking something that is rooted in mythology and rooted into like ancient history and making that into something more fun and adventurous. Like I feel like these are such great ways for people to kind of tap into the magic that history holds. And
Mm-hmm.
you look at cinema today and there's like some movies that even talk about things in the past. Like last night I went to go watch the movie Hamnet, and it's about William Shakespeare, somebody that a lot of people, I mean, today, like as a society, we can even collectively say that we don't really know a lot about this guy. He was born in the 1500s, and the
Mm-hmm.
documents are extremely aged, and we're just putting together the pieces. But you take a figure like that and you look at the plays that he's created that's been able to hold on through history for so long. I mean, that inspired things like Star Wars, inspired things like The
Yeah.
Lion King, inspired so many moments of pop culture that we don't even realize is all influenced by history. And
Mm-hmm.
I love how like you're talking about military history, and I actually read the book Napoleon by Andrew Roberts, and I think that is such a great biography on him. And what you were saying about how even though we know the grander scheme of things about how things played out in history, the little details are just as important to flesh out and to kind of explore and kind of share. I think is extremely important because I think the smaller details is what allows that human connection to allow you to
Mm-hmm.
kind of understand how people in the past thought, even though you're not in that time. I remember when I was reading the Napoleon book, there's a lot of like theories and ideas on how Napoleon operated in France. But, when the thing that I loved about that novel, or the book, the biography that I just mentioned, is, like, in the first couple of chapters, it has nothing to do with Napoleon's greatest achievements. It has everything to do with, like, his failures and, like, his struggle to kind of find out who he is as a person. And I
Mm.
think that is probably, I could argue that is just as important as the military things that, we talk about in history, because when you understand Napoleon as a person, you understand Napoleon as a military strategist, and later on, a king, or, a monarch of France, and later on a greater
Hmm.
part of Europe. And that is like one of the greatest things that I feel like history allows us to understand is the human struggle never really changes. It's just in different lens. And you see how other people kind of struggle with the same things that like we kind of see today, which is identity, search of purpose, wanting to create a better world, wanting to kind of, help those that need help. These are very important things. And I like how, you are open to being that scholar to kind of speak on that and do the research. I applaud you because that's hard work. I can only imagine creating these articles. That is a lot.
That is very true. And thank you, Nathan, again for that. I mean, that you actually hit the nail on the head that the major events of either people or places are important for study, but the lead ups to that, the human stories that may be intertwined, are also important. And even going a step further, one I've always found very fascinating is, of course, the role of speculative history or alternative history in fiction. And I have heard a lot of debate and a lot of discussions on this is that, oh, alternate history is a little bit more fun experimentation of, what history could have been. And that is true. That is true. But for me as an author and also as a historian, if I'm going to write alternate history, I want to write something that's probably the most closest version of a hypothetical scenario that could have happened. And two case studies that I have written personally are Amnetus, Son of Persia, and Decimus, the Wolf of Rome, because they are both historical fiction in their own right, but they're mainly alt history with a little bit of fantasy. For Son of Persia, you follow the main character, Amyntas Baru, who was a Spartan during the Second Greco-Persian War. Now, in history, we know the Greeks win, they kick the Persians out, and it would be many years until Alexander the Great comes to power and conquers all of Greece and subsequently the Persian Empire. My book wanted to ask a different question. If the Greeks had lost the Battle of Plataea, what would have happened? And instead of using research to find out, okay, this is what would have happened, I used research to answer the question, what aren't the uh, scholastic journals, what aren't the academics telling us? What is not being told? And from that perspective, I was able to write not only an engaging story, a very human story, and one that a lot of people resonate with, but a world that is still very much familiar and yet very, very different. And then for Decimus, the Wolf of Rome, a lot of readers have said that it was an improvement from the first because now I'm actually encompassing all of the Mediterranean because this one focuses on Rome and Carthage's war during the Second Punic Wars. And a lot of scholars agree if Rome lost that war in the 200s BC, then Western history as we know it and Western Europe as we know it would be vastly different. The Renaissance, quote unquote, would actually be centered in the Mediterranean with Sicily, southern Italy, North Africa as the hub. You would not have expansion into Spain, Gaul, Germania, or even Britannia. Those would have been entirely left to their own devices. The world would have been entirely different. And that was the fun aspect. That's what I enjoyed about writing Decimus the Wolf of Rome was experimenting with the world building. How different would our world be if Rome collapsed but was rebuilt by the Carthaginians as a trade city, as a colony, how different would it be? And a lot of readers, as I said, they've absolutely enjoyed the world building. They love the characters that help, progress the story. And for me as an historian specializing in classical history, that was the absolute blast of writing the book, and of course writing the epilogue, which I titled as the Histories Volume 1, in respect to the Histories, which was an ancient Greek journal written by probably the father of history himself, as an homage.
That is probably one of the coolest things I've ever heard so far on an interview because like I could just hear the passion that like you're showing when you're talking about the plot of Decimus and how your inspirations of, Mediterranean history like in the BC era has influenced like your hypotheticals and what you're basing this off of. um I think even as an outsider, like, I don't personally, as much as I do love history, I admit that I don't know a lot about like specific battles or like, too much
Mm,
of like a specific time. But I really enjoy how, even though I don't know too much about what you were just saying, like I still felt that energy and it kind of excited me to like, kind of look into something. Like, are you telling me like really like if Rome didn't win one battle, this would affect not only Europe but like the how the world would operate? Like that is so insane because you never really think about how the determination of one moment at one time like could really affect the rest of the world like for all time. I mean, that's actually insane. And you're speaking about the Renaissance, and I remember learning in school that the Renaissance was one of the biggest improvements, not only in the way that humanity looked at art, but just how they looked at just life in general. Like there was,
mm-hmm.
there was the exploration of humanism, there was the exploration of like that versus secularism. The Renaissance was when people started looking at different contexts of God and how religion operates in their own lives. Buildings started changing their forms of architecture. There was an emphasis on not pushing the envelope because we have to, but why not explore the best of our abilities and see what is really out there. And that's when you start getting really known people like the painters that we know of the Renaissance, the
Right.
Michelangelos, the Da Vinci's, like all these people that start like innovating. It's so exciting because it's like, what the heck, like, what really makes people want to explore themselves and want to better themselves for the sake of like wanting to just share what they found out with humanity. And it's like crazy to know that that all could have been affected if Rome didn't win one battle, and like the whole world would have been different and would have changed. So I think that's really interesting that you share that, and I think that kind of creates another argument to understand why history is so important. I mean, it helps you kind of see the world in a different lens. Like, you look at it and you start showing more. Of course, there's a lot of ugly parts of history as well, but there
Mm-hmm.
is a little bit of gratitude to kind of look outside your house and kind of be like, dang, like the way this world is because of like how everything just happened to be. And there are some pros to that, I could say. Like, like just seeing the things that we see today, it's like, wow, that's awesome. Especially when you look at literature, right? Like you look at
Yes.
books, and I would argue that like you look at the arts, and it's such a beautiful evolution of how it started with like people say like in the Greeks, like you go to Greece and you see manuscripts still of like the philosophers like understanding the world and the way that it operated, to now you're seeing textbooks talking about quantum physics. You're looking at like space exploration. You're looking at
Mm-hmm.
mathematics to a higher degree, and it's like, wow, like that's insane because we're seeing how we're able to implement those advancements in our lives today. So thank you for sharing that, and I guess I have like a really fun question to ask you. Like, in your opinion, like what are your favorite periods of history that you enjoy learning about? Like, are there any particular parts of history you're like, oh yeah, I am a nerd for this stuff? Or is it more of a general broader love for like history?
So I have a general love of history. I love learning about history in all facets. And funny enough, I'm actually working on two other books that are going to be exploring other periods in history that really don't get a lot of recognition. Now, one of my books that I'm working on, hopefully going to get it published this year, is set in 16th century Japan, but it's right after the Sengoku Wars, relatively speaking. And it's actually focusing on a period in not only Japanese history, but Chinese history and Korean history that doesn't get a lot of recognition, but it is a huge snowball effect for those three countries. And that is, of course, the invasion of Korea. Now, when I say that, a lot of people automatically think of World War II. And absolutely so. Japan invaded Korea during the 1930s. But that is considered the second invasion, or relatively third invasion. Japan actually invaded Korea back in the late 1500s with the sole purpose of trying to conquer Ming China. So the book that I am writing is an historical fiction which is kind of written in the style of a biography from the perspective of a fictional samurai who leads a band of soldiers, my version of the Band of Brothers that we saw in HBO's series by the same name. And it's their exploits from as young men in the 1560s and 70s, and ultimately growing into very powerful warriors, generals, even leading invasions into Korea with a little bit of family drama here and there sprinkled throughout. And the next book that I am working on that I am really excited to talk to people about is my first ever World War II epic. Now, there are many books on World War II, and rightly so. I think that those are incredible reads. For me, I wanted to write something that hadn't already been covered, something that has the making of an incredible story, and yet there's not a lot of recognition for that. And that is, of course, what I call the Swords of the Philippines, which focuses on the 26 Filipino scout cavalry who fought against the Japanese during the early invasion of the Philippines from December 1941, fighting all the way into April of 1942. This unit, which was a relic from World War I, was probably the most well trained unit who fought against the Japanese on horseback with outdated weapons and tactics. And yet, despite all that, they managed to hold off the Japanese for as long as they did. Because had it not been for them and others, the battle in the Pacific would have been greatly different. So that is another work that I am working on at the moment, and hopefully hope to have it published sometime next year.
So cool. That is so cool. I love that, man. That is awesome. That is awesome because it's like, okay, I love, like, there is definitely a fascination that I have towards like wars and stuff, and like, just seeing how, some of these stories of like heroics and like these people that, fight for as long as they do, and being able to, being like just change the all like the way that we look at history in terms of warfare. Like the works of individual people during that time greatly
Mm-hmm.
affect like how things turned out, and I think that is so cool. And I am so excited to read that one about like the swords of the Philippines. Like that one sounds insane because I definitely think that like that kind of reminds me of the Revolutionary War with George Washington, about how he was able to implement guerrilla warfare because the British forces, they had more military power coming into the into the colonies, but George Washington definitely understood that he had a better idea of the land. And so he was like, that's our powerhouse, is that when people come and invade us, they're coming to home territory. So like if we're able to use the world around us and the environment, we can get the upper hand. And that's cool how like, that form of understanding your own home territory to affect the outcome of a battle for people that are coming to invade. Like that is honestly one of the coolest things ever, because it just shows that, guns and military power sometimes doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really explain the whole story. It's also about like, persistence, determination, strategy. And it's cool that your stories kind of touch on that, and it kind of gives homage to people that I feel like are unfortunately forgotten in history during these important times. Like Nope, I don't remember learning about Swords of the Philippines and like people that were really fighting to
Mm-mm.
stall like the Japanese invasion, in any time when I was in high school. I didn't even know there were three invasions, and like to think that like, you're talking about one of them when there's textbooks that don't even mention any, just shows that like there is a need to kind of like have that conversation about, hey, like, number one, I remember growing up and thinking the only wars that existed were the ones that were centered around America. And that itself is incredibly false, because then you learn about the world and you're like, wait a minute, like these civilizations have also had their own triumphs and their defeats and have had their moments of fighting for what they believed in. And the fact that like, we live in a time where some people only know like a segment of like what is history, that
Mm-hmm.
you can argue like that is a shame, because it's like you're living on this world, you should at least understand how it came to be, especially where you are right now, like understanding how society prevailed and how society changed over the flows of history. And it's cool that your story is kind of, yes, there is a little bit of a historical fiction side, there's a fictional side to it, yes, there are some fantasy elements to it, but I don't think that really takes away from the fact that you're talking about a period of time that could be seen as a magical period, because this period affected everything else that happened after it. Like that is insane. And I appreciate you talking about like what's coming in the future, because that's a really cool way to kind of just show that your diversity and your love of history, it it could allow readers to kind of dip their toes based on what they want to get into. If they like
Mm-hmm.
Mediterranean history and the Greeks and like understanding Roman stuff, then maybe they can get into Decimus, or they can get into, if they like Michael, Archmichael, the angel and stuff, like okay, you can get into the trilogy of the Gathering. And if they like World War II, then they can wait till next year and they can read your story then. I think that's really cool that you're diversifying your portfolio and like the things that you want to write about. I think that's very cool. um
Yeah,
yeah.
I have to agree, Nathan. And as a little teaser for your listeners, those are only two of 15 stories that I've already planned out for the next 15 years of my life as an author. Yes, I have in the works about 15 stories, all of which are either sequels, spin offs, starts of new series, and I cannot wait to write these. In fact, there's one book which I love telling people. Well, it's two. And one is, of course, the Ranger trilogy. And this goes back to what you were talking about, Nathan, about, your appreciation for, the American Revolution, George Washington, and the founding fathers. And the Ranger trilogy is almost like a combination of three particular movies. You have the combines three particular movies: Spencer Tracy's Northwest Passage 1940, Daniel Day Lewis's Last of the Mohicans, and of course Mel Gibson's The Patriot. And it's my love of those three movies and the history of the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, following this character who is based on Nathaniel, uh, the Hawkeye from Last of the Mohicans, and you see him, as a young trapper. He's not involved in the war with the French and the British, but he somehow gets involved, and he meets my take on Chingachgook and Uncas, and he sort of forms his own teams as he enlists in the Ranger Corps, the Colonial Rangers. And you see, him meet others from different backgrounds. You have some freedmen, you have some escaped slaves, you have some immigrants, German, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and of course the various indigenous tribes that resided in the northeastern part of the United States during that time. And it's ultimately his journey as a young soldier in the British Army who fights the French. Of course, he has to fight a friend of his who turns traitor. And then we get to the third book, which is called The Ranger Birth of a New Nation. This one is very much inspired by Mel Gibson's The Patriot, where he's much older. He doesn't want to get involved in the War of Independence, but a villain from his past pushes him and brings him out of retirement, where he now has to create the American Colonial Ranger Corps, with the sole mission of not only fighting the British, but also protecting George Washington as a mercenary corps, the Jaeger Corps, has been tasked by the British, or rather, this particular British commander in the Northern Theater, to find Washington and to kill him. Not capture him, but to kill him. Because with Washington dead, the entire military and political infrastructure of the rebels, colonial rebels, would be gone. So that is the Ranger trilogy. This one, it's not so much historical as it's so much an homage to the westerns, and that is Shadows of Honor, a samurai western. Pretty much imagine this: an American kid, he goes with his father to Japan on the onset of Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition. His father marries a Japanese interpreter. The son grows up in Japan. He's fluent in Japanese. He understands the culture, and he fights in Japan's civil war for the emperor's army. His father is murdered by foreign mercenaries allied with the shogun. He now goes on a quest, takes him to Mexico, to Italy, to Egypt, and all the way back to Japan, 1876, where he finds out that the last man has joined the Imperial Army. He can't outright kill him because he'll be branded as a traitor. So what does he do? He joins a rebellious samurai lord, Saigo Takamori, and partakes in the Satsuma Rebellion. Now, that sounds familiar to your viewers and listeners. That is the inspiration for the premise of the Last Samurai movie with Tom Cruise. The rebellion, not so much as the main character or the villain. But that is a story that I'm very interested in really fleshing out because it does have a little bit of historical pieces of, Japan's Civil War, post Civil War America, post Revolution America after its battle with the French, and of course, world history, the reunification of Italy during the 1860s, the mercenary battles in Egypt and North Africa, and of course, Japan's final civil war in 1876.
Oh man, you need to be like a director or something, Gabriel. I feel like you can make like movies and TV shows on this. And we already are seeing it on TV, with the show Shogun. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned The Last Samurai. No, it's so cool to see like how historical fiction is just getting a little bit more of a platform, more and more growing, as we see a lot more people just be interested in moments of history and ask themselves like, what can we do with this? Like I think it's so interesting. And it reminds me of like the John Adams show, like on HBO
Oh my
Max.
gosh, such a good piece. Such a
Such
good piece
oh
of work.
yeah, so good. It's so good. And I'm really excited to see that type of spotlight also be applied to like other moments of history as well. And especially in world history. I think there's so much like interesting moments in world history that just goes beyond like what we know. And I'm really happy that you're one of the people that are interested in like, creating stories to kind of highlight the importance of like historical moments like that. And I thank you for like sharing all of it. And it kind of leads me to like another question where you have your podcast Tales from the Wandering Scribe, and allows you to not only talk to authors about their writing journeys, but also have conversations with historians to talk about multitude of topics. Like, what has that been like? Because it just sounds like you're such an avid fan of history. Like, what is it like talking to other writers or talking to other historians? Like, is that like, I'm sure like that's a different experience because writers, maybe they're not all based in history, but then historians, like, you're probably talking to people that are just as like knowledgeable as you are.
Absolutely, Nathan. Absolutely. So, as a little background for my podcast, Tales from the Wandering Scribe, it was around the same time when I was writing the first draft of The Gathering. And initially, I went on a few podcasts from fellow authors that I had connected with, and I realized, well, I want to do something very similar. So I started small and I began on Spotify, and I just did audio interviews, no face to face interviews, and it was fun. It was really really good, and as I started picking up momentum, I started to branch out. I started to write a newsletter. on LinkedIn. And my newsletter was very, very basic. It was mainly about, okay, here are the guests that I am featuring. Here are, some updates on my book. Here are some characters. And as I started interviewing more and more people, I realized, okay, a lot of people are enjoying this. Now I got to go take the next step. And that was, of course, creating a YouTube channel. Now, I already had a channel because I had to make one for for high school for a school project, and I had never used it for almost a decade or so. So I used that channel, rebranded it, changed it, and I just began conducting interviews. I got a lot of my good friends that I knew personally, and the first interview was December of 2022 with my good friend Kim Applegren. Shout out to her, based in South Africa. And it was just a very fun experience. And as I got more comfortable doing these types of interviews, Nathan, I realized, okay, there is something here. I want to branch out. I don't want to just talk simply with my friends that I've known during my lockdown years. I want to make this almost like yours, Nathan, a safe space for authors and fellow creatives. And that's when I started branching out and started getting a lot of people. And my two biggest hubs for guests have been Instagram and LinkedIn, and occasionally in person if I meet them and give them a business card or so. And from that point, it was just a downhill spiral of just incredible guests, amazing discussions. So much so that not only do I do author interviews, I do historians interviews, I do narrator interviews, I do book reviews. I have a series called The Historians Lounge, which is on its fourth season, where myself and a guest talk about an aspect of history, whether it's an event, a person, a discussion, or probably some works that are being reevaluated. And I've now passed 500 videos within 3 years. It will be its fourth year coming this December. And it's absolutely insane. I never imagined myself doing this almost like a job. This was always meant to be a hobby, and it still is a hobby. But as I look back on the success that I have gained thus far, and from the guests that I have met, I could not think of my life any different or anything else had I not had this show. It's opened so many doors. It's allowed me to meet so many amazing people, some of whom have become very close friends of mine. And the show has just been so amazing for a lot of people, especially for some of my guests who have never done interviews, who have never done anything like this before, as you and I are doing right now, Nathan. And with that said, I wanted, first and foremost, my show to be a safe space where we can talk about, going back to literature, different genres, different themes, how we approach characters, or how we develop stories, and showcasing our authenticity, but also writing something that's familiar. Because as authors, it's a struggle. It's not a get rich quick scheme. There's no guarantee you're going to be a success overnight. And probably one of the biggest things among the tidal wave of things that impact authors is trying to get engagement, trying to reach out to others, because we're not business people. We don't know how to make a sales pitch of our books. It's very, very difficult. And so I wanted my show to be a stepping stone, a platform for them where they can talk about their books, where they can share who they are, not just as the author, but as themselves, as the person, to give them that sense of confidence. And from then, I've actually talked with some alumni on the show who have gone on to be on other shows. Some like yours, Nathan. Actually, one guest that I actually had on my show was also on your show. Emily Rank,
Rank
I
Hawthorne.
believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, she was on my show as well. And when I saw that, I was like, awesome. awesome that she's on another show and going out there and stuff like that. So ultimately tying back to your question, Nathan, about, having historians, having authors, and what does it mean for me to have this show, it's been an absolute blast. And I'm so happy that a lot of people have found enjoyment being on the show.
That is such a great answer, and thank you so much for sharing that. And that's great. That is honestly so great because that's part of BookBase's mission, right? It's like being able to connect authors and readers as much as they can, because we live in a
Mm-hmm.
world where I just feel like reading is just not as prevalent as it used to be. And I do think that sometimes there are some things that, well, my personal experience with reading, I hated reading. Then BookBase happened, and now I'm a huge fan of reading. I read almost all the time, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's helped my brain feel like it functions better. My memory's gone better. I feel like I'm able to talk better, able to have better conversations. I think about things differently. I learn more perspectives of life. To be able to have these types of talks like the ones we're having and the one that you have in your show and the ones that we have with other authors, it kind of, just highlights the fact that there's so much to still be there's still so much to learn about reading and writing and like the
Yes.
journeys about being an author. And I think it's great that you're also doing that in your own way. And I really wish you like, greater success with your show. I feel like both of ours are going to grow at the
Mm-hmm.
same time as we're just keep on, collaborating with other people in our circle and stuff and even with each other. And I think that's so great. And, I think that's great. I just think it's a special thing that you just shared about how you're trying to even help people be more comfortable with talking in front of a camera, being able to pitch their stories. I remember when I was like talking in front of a camera, like I would be shaking all the time. Sometimes I still
Mm-hmm.
do. Like, don't I mean, I'm not gonna act like I'm not gonna act like I get it all the time. Like, no, there's moments where I'm straight up like my legs are shaking. I'm thinking really fast in my head. I'm like going through a mile, like just so many thoughts just going through my head, but to be there and create a special moment with somebody that put in the work and creating a story for the sake of sharing with other people, it feels really great. And there are some people that we've met on our journey that completely changed my life and like how I'm able to look at things, and it's given me such a great sense of accomplishment when like what you're saying is that you look back at your older videos and you look back on the people that helped you get to where you are now. It's just such a special moment. So I totally get where you're coming from, and I really hope that you just keep on getting more and more guests. Like, heck, if you need us on your show, we would definitely be willing to like talk to you and stuff. I think there's so many great things that are out there that that are in this realm that we're trying to get into. So thank you for sharing that. And, it kind of leads to our last question. What do you think is the importance of socializing around books? Since you're also talking to authors and you're doing a podcast where, you're talking about books, like, what do you think is important about that?
I think what's important about, talking about books and sharing books is the expansion of knowledge. At the end of the day, books, whether it's novellas, fiction, literary books, it's all about the pursuit of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. And I know a lot of people may argue that fiction books may not have a lot to offer. I argue in the opposite. I think fiction books have the opportunity and have shown that you can talk about real world issues interwoven with your book's main premise. And a really good example of that I have read as a reader is the duology by Stephen Arion, which is The Coward and the Warrior. Now, what I loved so much about that particular book series, Nathan, is that it took the hero's journey and threw it on its head. Because you have a main character, he is this great hero, or at least that's what we are told about him. He is this epic demon slayer. He is a hero of the realms. But in all truth, he was just a naive kid who just got lucky. And his entire party was killed. These weren't heroes, these were just vagrant, boastful people who all died horrible, and tragic deaths. He, as a young man, survived. And because he survived, he is known as the hero. And what I found very fascinating is that the author was able to take the hero's journey again, throw it on its head, and present us a character who clearly is struggling and suffering from PTSD, who does not want to get involved in any other, you know, quests or travels. He just wants to be alone, but he doesn't have a choice. He gets thrust into another journey. He now has his own band of heroes. And he has another young kid who wants to be like him. And he's actively trying to tell him, don't be like me. And the young kid, he doesn't know any better. He thinks that he's a coward. And as you read throughout the book, the young kid soon begins to realize that there's no glory in a quest like this. It's suicide. You're going to die, either by the monster or by nature. And I absolutely love that. And another really good example of bringing real life issues and topics to storytelling is the Last Luminian by my good friend and fellow author S.G. Blaze. Her character struggles with panic attacks, and she writes that so perfectly and authentically. It's not used as a gimmick, it's not used as a joke, it's used to highlight a trauma that the character went through as a child, and there are triggers for that. There are triggers that the character has to experience, or I shouldn't say has to experience, but does experience throughout the book. And I love how she was able to do that. And there are so many other authors that have also written their stories to be a safe space for their readers to talk about issues in a way that is both respectful but doesn't downplay the significance of it. Because I think at the end of the day, storytelling needs to do that. It needs to understand the audience that it's writing for to get its point across, but never dumb down the importance or the significance of it. Because no matter what age group you write for, whether it's middle grade, YA, new adult, or adult fiction, and no matter what genre that you're writing for, you can still have it follow what I like to call the three E's: educate, entertain, and enlighten. And I believe all books follow those three E's and should be a staple for not just fiction authors, but for anyone who is passionate about the written word. If you can follow the three E's, then you are realizing the true potential of the written word to educate people about topics, to entertain, to take them to a different place, even if it's just for a little bit, and finally to enlighten, make them reflect on why these themes were important. I mean, we grew up doing book reviews in school. We had to answer these questions. So let's just continue that. Let's continue this discussion based upon the three E's. And that is why I think it is important to continue reading, to share reading, because reading is such a beautiful thing. And now more than ever, we need to still have it.
What a great way to like just kind of wrap up everything that we've talked about, right? Like I just think we started this conversation about your first book and we're talking about, your love for history. We're talking about the importance of like history, talking about the importance of like meeting people that also write and helping to spread that message. And then finally we're talking about just the importance of literature itself and like the storytelling aspect and what it
Mm-hmm.
provides. Your 3E statement, I think, is the most powerful thing that we've talked about thus far because that's a beautiful takeaway. And I totally agree with you. If you're able to educate for someone to know better about something, but also making them feel comfortable and also making them feel excited for learning about something, you naturally do lead to the third E, where you enlighten them in the sense where the critical thinking kicks in and they start taking your story and they start applying it to other mechanisms that they see in life, or like other situations where they might apply it towards. And I think if you're able to teach that to people at any age, from that moment on, you're doing them a service by allowing them to kind of cultivate their own form of thinking through their own perspective and learning through other people's words how they want to live their life in a better way. And I think that is such a great way to just kind of like, no, I think it's a great ending note, because
Mm-hmm.
I think we've talked about, like, it kind of goes full circle where, you talk about writing, you talk about the importance of sharing history, the importance of like talking about literature, and it leads to this moment where it's like, yeah, like at the end of the day, you want to help people, you want to share. And like, yeah, there are some people that just want to write just for the sake of entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that. But like you're saying, like if you want to get to the highest degree of writing, it's like at some point is that you do, like, whether you acknowledge it or not, like you do tap into this form of education or this enlightenment where people put the book down, and it's not just, oh, that was a good book, and they leave. It's just like, wow, like what did I just experience? Like, what is this? What is this? Why do I feel this way? What is this kind of make me think about things in the future? Where do I want to
Mm-hmm.
be? It kind of makes people want to be like, when do they want to be the heroes in their story? You never know. You write a story about, what you were saying, a coward, or somebody that struggles from PTSD, somebody that struggles with anxiety and panic attacks, and for the audience that may do also suffer from, those symptoms and those conditions, it might even inspire them to be the heroes in their own story and kind of be like, hey, this character suffers from the same things that I suffer from, and they were able to do this. Yes, it's hard, but maybe I can kind of follow a little bit of that path and see where that takes me, because I love the
Mm-hmm.
story so much. That's the beautiful part of storytelling and just writing stories to share with other people. And I just want to say, Gabriel, like, thank you so much for being on this this talk, and being able to be interviewed and just open up and share all these things. Like, that this is exactly what BookBase is about. It's about educating, it's about entertaining, but it's also about enlightening. And like, for you to say that triple E statement again, like, that's just such a powerful thing to end on. So thank you so much for being on here and allowing us to just talk to you about your love for history and your love of writing. And I'm sure we're going to see you again on this platform at some point. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you so much for the opportunity for coming on your guys' show and for allowing me to talk about my books, my journey, and everything in between. And for also my listeners who are watching this from the Wandering Scribe. If you would like to see Nathan and some of the other members of the book-based team on the Wandering Scribe show in their own interview, then you know what you have to do. Comment below on this video, follow us on social media, and we'll make it happen. I will definitely love to have Nathan and the other members of BookBase on the Wandering Scribe. So, you know what you have to do, viewers and listeners. If you want to see that happen, follow us on social media, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see what happens.